The wind had already taken the town's voices, the horses, the coach, and every soul with somewhere better to be. It should have taken her too. Instead, she stood at the edge of that empty platform with her back straight as a fence post, and her eyes fixed on the rails going nowhere, and I sat 40 feet away in my saddle telling myself it was none of my business. I'd learned to keep accounts. Cattle, coins, debts, dead men. I wrote them all down in a little tally book so the world would balance out even when it didn't. And I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest. I made her a promise that day I had no right to make, no money to keep, and no idea how much it would cost me. I keep it in the book still, last line smudged. I never could bring myself to finish writing it. The stage pulled out of Dry Fork at 4:15 with a full box of passengers and a driver who spat once at the ground like the whole town had insulted him. I watched it go from the shade of the depot wall, counting heads out of pure habit, 6 inside, 2 up top, a mail sack, a crate of somebody's china that wouldn't survive the wash at Coyote Creek. I wrote nothing down. There was nothing owed to me on that coach. Then the dust came up. Not a real storm, not the kind that buries fences and chokes calves in the open. Just an afternoon wind the color of a rusted skillet, the kind that comes off the flats in April and reminds you that the land was here first and would be here after. It hazed the sun to a coin. It rattled the loose board over the ticket window. And it emptied the platform faster than a gunshot, everybody scurrying for doorways and hat brims, until the boards were bare, and the town had that hollow Sunday feeling even though it was a Tuesday. Everybody except her. She stood at the far end of the platform where the rail spur ran out to the loading pens. An Apache woman, maybe 30, maybe older. The sun out here lies about ages, adds 10 years to some and strips them off children. She wore a calico blouse gone soft with washing and a heavy wool skirt too warm for the season, and over her shoulders a blanket she did not pull tight even when the grit came stinging. Her hair was tied back with a strip of red trade cloth. She held a small bundle against her chest, the way you hold a thing you have already decided to die protecting. She did not run from the wind. She did not squint. She looked down the empty rails like she was reading them. I'm going to tell you my name because it matters to the counting. Amos Kettle, 39 that spring, a leaseholder running 400 head on borrowed grass north of Dry Fork, and a man with a habit I can't shake. I keep a tally book in my breast pocket and a stub of pencil behind my ear, and I write down what happens so it doesn't get away from me. My wife used to say I'd write down my own funeral if they gave me the time. She's been gone 6 years. I still write things she'd have found funny in the margins, just so somebody does. So there I sat, on a horse named Poor Judgment because that's what buying him had been, and I did the thing a sensible man does. I turned him toward home. I got maybe 100 feet up the road before the counting caught me. Because here's what I'd tallied without meaning to. The stage was gone, and it was the last one till Thursday. The rail didn't run passenger through Dry Fork at all. That spur was cattle and freight only, and the next freight wasn't due till who knew when, and no freight took a woman standing alone. The hotel wouldn't put up an Apache, not in that town, not in that year. The church would have locked its door. And the wind was going to blow till dark, and the dark out here in April drops the temperature 40 degrees inside an hour. She had nowhere to go. And everyone in Dry Fork had looked right through her on their way to somewhere warm, same as I was fixing to do. I told myself she had people. They all had people, didn't they, out on the reservations, and this was some errand I didn't understand and would only insult by meddling in. I told myself a man who stops for every hard case on the road ends up with an empty book and an emptier belly. I told myself 6 or 7 sensible things. Then I turned Poor Judgment around, because I am not, in the end, a sensible man. My wife could have told you that, too. I rode up slow, hat off, which felt foolish the second I did it, and I put it half back on. She heard the horse and turned, not startled, just aware, the way a person turns who has learned that not watching gets you hurt. Up close her face was all plains and weather, and there was a cut healing over one eyebrow, and her eyes went to my hip first the way anybody's would in that country, checking for the pistol. It was there. I saw her see it. I saw her decide it didn't change anything because she had already run out of things a pistol could take from her. Ma'am, I said, stupid word, I said it anyway. Coach is gone, there won't be another till Thursday. She looked at me, said nothing. You waiting on somebody? Still nothing, but her arms tightened on the bundle, and I understood then it wasn't goods she was holding. It was empty. She was holding the shape of something that used to be there. The wind gusted and flung grit, and I turned my face and cussed. And when I turned back, she was watching me with something that wasn't quite scorn, but was in the same family. The look of a person watching a fool discover the weather. "I have coffee," I said, which was true, and "I have a fire up at my place and a roof, and I give you my word nobody there will trouble you," which was, I realized as I said it, a promise, and the first of several I would make that day with no clear sense of the ledger they'd run up. She spoke then. Her English was slow and careful, each word set down like a stone across a creek. "The train," she said, "the one that carries the children." And the bottom fell out of my afternoon. Because I knew the train she meant. Everybody knew, though nobody said. A month back the agency had run a car up the cattle spur, quiet dawn, no announcement, to load the reservation children for the government schools back east. Carlisle or one of the others like it. They took them by the dozen, sometimes with the parents' marks on a paper the parents couldn't read, and sometimes without any paper at all. And they cut the children's hair and gave them new names and told them their language was a sin. And a good number of them came back in boxes, and a good number more didn't come back and were simply written down somewhere as pupils, present, doing well. I'd seen the car go through. I remember I'd been at the pens counting a shipment, and I'd looked up and seen small faces at the barred windows, and I had done exactly nothing, and I had not written it in my book because some things you don't want the book to say you knew. "They took him," she said, not a question. She had stopped looking at me. She was looking at the rails again, at the empty shine of them running east into the haze, and I understood that she had walked from wherever the agency held her people, days of it, to stand where she had last seen the train, as if standing in the right place could reel it back. "My son. They put him on the train. I came to bring him home. But the train," her hand lifted, opened, let go of nothing. "The man in the little house says the train is gone. Says there is no train, says go away." The man in the little house was the depot agent, Ferris, a soft pink weasel of a fellow who I'd watched shortchange a Mexican freighter twice and smile about it. I looked over at the depot. The lamp was lit inside now against the brown afternoon. Ferris was in there warm, and this woman was out here in the wind, and the arithmetic of that made a sound in my head like a scale tipping. Here is where I want to be honest with you, because I've had a long time to think on it and I won't pretty it up. I did not, in that moment, resolve to be a good man. I have never been sure I am one. What I felt was smaller and more selfish than that. I felt the 6-year-old wound in my own chest turn over, because I'd had a son too, 2 days old and then not. And a wife who lived 3 more years and then followed him, mostly from the not living, any more that had gotten into her after. And I had stood at a different kind of empty station and looked at a different set of rails going nowhere and felt exactly what this woman's straight back and dry eyes were telling me she felt. That the world had loaded up the thing you loved and carried it off down a track you weren't allowed to follow. I didn't say any of that. I'm not built to. What I said was, "What's the boy's name?" She looked at me a long moment, weighing whether the name was safe to spend. Then she gave it to me, a word in her language, soft in the middle that I couldn't have spelled to save my life. And then, bitterly, the other thing. The paper calls him Charles. They write on the paper Charles, and they take his hair, and they say now he is Charles. I took out my book. I want you to picture it, this idiot on a horse in a dust storm, taking out a stub of pencil to write in a greasy little tally book while a woman's whole grief stood in front of him. But it was the only thing my hands knew how to do with a thing too big to hold. So I wrote. I wrote the boy, and then I stopped, because I didn't have the name, and I wasn't going to write Charles. That wasn't his name. That was the name of the theft. I asked her to say hers again, slow, and I did my best, and I wrote it the way it sounded to me, Enchai, which she told me later on a better day means wind, and which fit her so well I've never been able to unhear it. And under it, without deciding to, I wrote, "I will help her get her son." Then I looked at what I'd written, and my stomach dropped. Because writing a thing in that book had always meant it was owed, and now I owed it, and I had no earthly idea how a leaseholder with 400 mortgaged cattle and 1 bad horse was going to pry a stolen child out of a government school 2,000 miles away. "Ma'am," I said, my mouth was dry and it wasn't the dust. "I don't know where they took him. I don't know if I can bring him back. I'd be lying if I said I did." She was watching me, and I made myself hold her eyes. "But I know the man who runs this line, and I know he keeps a book same as I do with every car that comes through and where it went, and I aim to go read it. And then we'll know more than we know now. That's all I can promise, that we'll know more." It wasn't much, It's a poor thing to offer a mother, we'll know more. But it was true, and I've come to believe the true small thing beats the grand false one every time, and I saw her hear the difference. Something in her shoulders moved, not softening, just recognition. The way you nod at another person carrying the same load up the same hill. Why, she said. One word, why would you? Why should I trust it? Why does a white man on a horse stop when the whole town walked past? I could have told her about my son. I didn't. I've never been able to make that wound into a sentence for a stranger. So I told her the other true thing, the one I could get out. Because everybody left, I said. And you're still standing here, and I've had about all I can stomach of leaving. The wind eased then, the way it does, dropping all at once so the sudden quiet rings in your ears. The coin of sun found a gap and laid a bar of gold across the platform boards, right between us, and I remember thinking it looked like a line drawn, like the ledger had ruled off one column and was fixing to start another. She stepped over it, came toward the horse, stopped a careful distance and looked up at me, and for the first time something in her face let go just a hair, just at the corner of the mouth. Not a smile, God knows, but the ghost of the thing a smile is built on. His mark is on his wrist, she said. Here. She touched her own, the inside where the blue veins run. A burn. When he was small, he pulled a coal from the fire because he wanted to hold the light. It leaves a scar the shape of. She made a small crooked sign with her finger. A bird, a hook, I couldn't tell. So when they cut his hair and change his clothes and write him a new name, you will still know him. His name is not on the paper. His name is on his skin, and I put it there, and it does not wash off. I wrote that down, too. Scar, inside left wrist. Cole, she'll know him. So will I, and I have carried the picture of that scar in my head for so long now that I sometimes think I'd recognize the boy in a crowd of 1,000, and I never even met him, not then, not yet. We went to the depot together, and I want to tell you Ferris, the agent, took one look at my face and folded. But that's not how it went. That's the grand false version. What actually happened is he saw the woman behind me and his soft pink face closed like a fist, and he said we don't serve Indians. And I said, I'm not asking you to serve her, Ferris. I'm asking to see the freight book. And he said that's agency business and railroad business and none of yours, Kettle. And he put his hand under the counter where I knew he kept a scattergun. And that's where I'll leave it for now, because that hand under the counter is where the easy part of this story ended, and the part that cost me began. And I've learned it's better to tell the costly parts with a clear head and a fresh page. But I'll tell you the thing I understood standing in that depot with the lamp hissing and the dust ticking against the glass and a scared little tyrant reaching for a gun. I understood I'd already crossed over, not when I turned the horse around, not even when I wrote the promise. It was when she showed me the scar, when she handed me the one thing she had left of her boy, a burn on a wrist I couldn't see, and trusted a stranger to carry it. You don't get handed a thing like that and hand it back. You just don't. I set my own hand flat on the counter, easy, where Ferris could see it was empty, and I smiled at him the way you smile at a snake you've decided not to be afraid of. Ferris, I said, let's you and me have a conversation about your book. I have been threatened by better men than Ferris, and it did not improve them. He was the kind of coward that gets brave behind a counter, and I'd counted enough of his sort to know the arithmetic. A man who reaches slow for a gun he keeps hidden is a man who wants you to see him reach so he won't have to use it. He was buying his own courage on credit and hoping I'd pay it off by leaving. Go on and pull it, I said, quiet. Then explain to the agency why you shot a leaseholder over a look at a freight manifest. Explain it to the railroad, too. They do love a clean book, and you'd be an awful smear on it. I let that sit. Or you show me which car went east on the 9th of March, and where it was billed, too. And I ride out of here, and you go back to being warm, and nobody ever knows we spoke. His hand came up empty. I've never been so relieved to be right about a coward. The freight book was a big ruled ledger not so different from my own, only fatter and full of other men's cattle. He turned the pages with a wet thumb and would not look at the woman, and she stood by the door with the dust ticking at the glass behind her and watched his hands like a hawk watches grass. And there it was on the 9th, a single passenger-fitted car coupled to the eastbound freight, billed through to a name I made him repeat twice so I'd write it right. Consignment, Indian pupils per agency order. Destination, rail junction at Fort Reeve, thence overland to the industrial school. Fort Reeve, I knew it or knew of it. A day and a half's hard ride east and north up where the flats broke into rimrock. Not 2,000 miles then, not Carlisle, not yet. The children got collected at Fort Reeve and held at a receiving station until there were enough of them to fill a car for the long haul east, which meant I did the arithmetic 3 times because I couldn't believe the mercy of it, which meant if the long train hadn't gone yet, the boy might still be at Fort Reeve. Might, I want to be careful with that word because I saw what it did to her when I told her, and I've regretted the size of the hope I handed her without a fence around it. I said he might still be there. And Enchai, I'll call her that. It's what I've called her in my heart for years. Enchai made a sound I have never been able to describe and have never forgotten. A short, broken intake like a person surfacing from deep water, and her hand went to her mouth. And for 1 second the straight back I'd admired all afternoon simply gave out, and she put her other hand on the door frame to hold herself up. Then she straightened, fast, like she was ashamed to have been caught hoping. And that shamed me that she'd learned to be ashamed of it, and I wrote nothing for a while because my own eyes had gone unreliable. Ferris said sour, "You didn't hear it from me." And I said no, Ferris, I surely did not, and I meant it, because a man who helps you while pretending he isn't is still a man who helped you, and I've learned to take help in whatever cowardly package it arrives. We rode out of Dry Fork in the last of the light. She rode behind me on Poor Judgment, which the horse rescented, and we made a cold camp in a wash 6 miles on because I didn't trust the dark road and I didn't trust the town at our backs. I gave her the coffee I'd promised and a strip of jerky and my other blanket, and I sat across the little fire from her and did the thing I do, which is talk too much when I'm frightened. I told her about the cattle, about the lease and the bank, and the way a man out here spends his whole life renting the ground he'll be buried in. I told her about the horse and why he was named Poor Judgment. I did not tell her about my son, but somewhere in the middle of a story about a calf that had followed me around like a dog one whole summer, she looked at me across the coals with those Weatherand Plains eyes and said, plain as anything, "You have lost a child." I stopped. The fire ticked. I don't know how she knew, whether it was the promise, or the way I'd looked at the small faces I described, or just the recognition that runs between people who have stood at the same rail. I found I couldn't lie to her. "A boy," I said, 2 days, and then his mother slower. I turned my hat in my hands. So, she agreed, and that was all. She didn't tell me it was God's plan or that they were in a better place or any of the things people said to me for years that made me want to throw them down a well. She just let the word so stand there between us, doing the work of a whole sermon, and I have never in my life felt so precisely understood by so few words. Then she told me about him, about the boy, not the tragedy of him, the him of him, that he was 7 and asked questions faster than anyone could answer them, that he'd pulled the coal from the fire not because he was foolish, but because he wanted, in his words, to hold the light in his hand and carry it around, and that even burnt and screaming he'd been furious the light went out. That he could imitate every bird on the flats and did it to fool his grandmother, who pretended every time to be fooled. That when the agency men came, he had not cried. That she had told him fast in their language, before they pulled him up into the car, "Remember the birds, remember the light, I am coming," and that she did not know if he had heard, and that not knowing was the thing that woke her in the night worse than all the rest. I wrote his name in my book again, better this time, and I wrote 7. And I wrote the birds, the light, and I have those words still, and they are worth more to me than every head of cattle I ever counted. We reached Fort Reeve the next afternoon, and it went wrong immediately. I'll spare you the grand version, where I talked our way in. What happened is there was a receiving station on the edge of the fort, a long, low building with a fenced yard, and a hard-faced matron and 2 soldiers bored enough to be dangerous, and a superintendent named Prout who came out wiping his mouth from his dinner and looked at me and passed me at Enchai, and understood the whole thing in about 2 seconds and hated it. He was polite, that was the worst of it. He didn't threaten, didn't sneer. He stood there in a clean coat and told me kindly that the children were wards of the government now, that their enrollment was legal and their care was the nation's mercy, that the woman had no standing because, and here he produced a paper, because a mark had been made granting the child to the school's guardianship. And did I understand he could not simply hand a federal ward to any Indian who wandered up claiming kinship, that they got that all the time, that it was for the children's own protection. That surely a reasonable white man could see the sense in it. And I stood there and felt the trap of it close, because every word he said was armored in law, and I had nothing but a tally book and a promise and a woman whose mark on a paper meant she'd signed away her own son without being able to read what she signed. Enchai had gone very still beside me. She was looking through the fence into the yard, and I followed her eyes, and there were children in there. A dozen more in gray uniform clothes, hair shorn to the skull, standing too quiet in rows while a young teacher walked the line. And they all looked the same. That was the horror of it. That was the whole design of it. They had made them all look the same so a mother couldn't find her own across a yard. "Superintendent," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I was. "I'm not asking you to hand over a ward on my say-so. I'm asking you one thing. There's a boy in your rolls enrolled the 9th of March off the Dry Fork Spur. You've got him written as Charles. I'd like to see his wrist. The inside of his left wrist, that's all. You show me that wrist, and if I'm wrong, we ride out and trouble you no more." Prout frowned. "Why the wrist?" And I looked at Chai, and she looked at me, and I understood she was leaving it to me, that she had handed me the scar to carry, and now the carrying was mine to finish. "Because," I said, "his mother put a mark on him that your rolls don't have and your scissors can't cut. And I'd like to see whether the government's paperwork or a mother's memory keeps the better book." I saw it land. Prout was not a monster. That's the thing nobody wants to hear about how it worked. He was a decent, ordinary man doing a monstrous thing and believing it was mercy, and for one moment I watched the ordinary man in him war with the machine he served. And I want to tell you the ordinary man won, but I've promised you the true version, and the true version is I don't know what would have won, because that's when the boy decided the matter himself. Because a child in the yard had heard something, not words, we were too far and he had his back to us. But Chai, without raising her voice, without any warning, made a sound low in her throat. A bird call. One of the ones she'd told me he could do. Soft, quick, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't listening your whole life for it. And one small gray figure in the two quiet rows went rigid. And turned. He turned, and for a moment nothing moved. He was smaller than I'd built him in my head. They're always smaller. His hair was gone to gray stubble that made his ears stand out and his eyes enormous, and the uniform hung on him like a sack, and there was a stillness on him that a 7-year-old should never own, the stillness of a child who has learned that being noticed is dangerous. He did not run to her. That's the detail that undid me, that stays with me, that I put in the book last and pressed so hard the pencil near tore the page. He did not run to her because they had already taught him in a month that running to the thing you love gets you punished. He just looked. Across the yard, across the fence, across everything they had done to him. He looked at his mother, and his whole small body strained toward her without moving 1 inch, quivering with the effort of holding still, and his mouth opened, and no sound came out because they had taken the sound too. They had told him his words were a sin, and he did not yet know which language he was allowed to cry in. Chai did not scream or run at the fence. I think a lesser grief would have. Hers was too big to run. She took 1 step and put her hand flat against the wire, palm open, fingers spread, and she said his name, his real one, the soft-middled word, just once, quiet, the way you'd say a prayer you weren't sure was allowed anymore. And the boy raised his left arm, slow, deliberate, and he turned the inside of his wrist toward us, toward the fence, toward her, and even from where I stood I could see it. The pale, crooked mark of an old burn, the scar shaped like a bird or a hook or a small-held flame, and he showed it to her the way you'd show a soldier a flag, the way you'd show the world the one thing about you they hadn't managed to take. His name is on his skin, she'd told me, and it does not wash off. I have counted a great many things in my life, cattle and coins and the days since my wife died. I have never counted anything as carefully as I counted the seconds Prout stood there watching a mother and a shorn child hold up a scar between them across a government fence. Because in those seconds the whole thing hung, the law and the mercy and the machine and the ordinary man inside it. And I did not say a word, because some ledgers you don't get to write, you only get to witness. Here is what happened, and I'll give it to you straight, because it is not the ending you want, and it is the true one. Prout did not open the gate and give her the boy. The law didn't allow it, and he wasn't brave enough to break the law, and I have made my peace with despising him for that even while I understand it. What he did, after a long time, after wiping his mouth again with a hand that shook a little, what he did was let her in. For an hour, supervised in the yard under the bored eye of the soldiers with the matron timing it on a watch. 1 hour. He said it was against regulations, and he'd deny it if asked, and if I ever repeated it, he'd have my lease looked into. He said all that in his clean coat, hating me, hating himself, doing the one small, merciful thing the machine had left him room to do. In hours, I did not go in, it wasn't mine. I stood at the fence with my hat in my hands, and I watched a woman sit in the dust of a receiving station yard with her son in her lap. Too big to be held like that, folding himself small anyway, small as he could go, and I watched her talk to him low and steady in the language they'd forbidden him, pouring it into him. A whole hour of it, every word she could think of, the birds and the light and the grandmother and the names of things. Filling him back up with himself as fast as she could before they emptied him again. I watched him cry, finally, in the right language. I watched her not cry, so he'd have somewhere steady to put his crying. And I stood at that fence, and I understood at last and completely what my promise had bought and what it hadn't. I could not get him back. No man could, not that day, not with a tally book and a good heart. The machine was too big, and the law was on its side, and I was one leaseholder with 400 mortgaged cattle and a bad horse. That was the true size of me against the true size of it, and I have never felt smaller or counted myself more honestly. But I had brought her the hour. I want you to sit with that because I've had to. All I could do was carry a scar across a day and a half of hard country and hand a mother 1 hour in the dust with her son. It was not enough. It will never be enough. And it was the most important thing I have ever done, and both of those are true, and the space between them is where I've lived ever since. When the matron called time, the boy did not scream. He'd already learned. He stood up out of his mother's lap, and he made his small body still again, the terrible learned stillness, and he walked back to the gray rose without being told, and only his wrist, held a little out from his side with the scar turned toward her, said what his mouth wasn't allowed to. Enchai stood in the yard and did not reach for him and did not fall down, and I do not know to this day how she paid the price of that stillness, only that she paid it in full, standing up. We rode back the way we came. She did not speak for a long time, and I did not fill the silence, having finally learned. Somewhere on the second day she said to the horizon, "You kept your promise." And I said, "No, ma'am, I didn't. I promised you we'd know more, and I promised nothing after, and I could not bring him home." And she was quiet a while, and then she said, "You promised to help me get my son." She touched the inside of her own wrist, the way she had that first day on the platform. "For 1 hour I got my son. You did not know it would be only an hour, but you carried me to the hour." I did not have an answer for that. I still don't. I have turned it over 10,000 times, and I cannot decide if she was forgiving me for the smallness of what I'd done or thanking me for the size of it, and I have come to think she meant both, the way she seemed to mean everything, more than one true thing at once. I took her as far as I could, to the edge of the agency land, where her people were held, where I could not follow without making trouble that would land on her. She got down off poor judgment. She stood a moment. Then she did a thing I did not expect. She reached up and took my hand, the writing hand, the one with the pencil callus, and she turned it over and looked at the palm like she was reading a rail line in it, and she pressed something into it and closed my fingers over it. It was a small thing carved from bone. A bird. Rough, a child's work, the kind of thing a 7-year-old whittles and gives his mother. She had carried it all this way, the shape of the thing she'd been holding on the platform that first day, the empty bundle that wasn't empty after all. "So you keep the count right," she said, and something at the corner of her mouth moved, the ghost of the thing a smile is built on, the same one from the platform, come back at the very end. "You lost a boy." "I did not get mine, but for 1 hour, you were there for the hour." She let go my hand. "That is not nothing, Amos Kettle, that is not nothing." Then she walked onto the agency land and did not look back, because she had learned, same as her son, that looking back at the thing you love in front of the wrong people can cost you, and she was done paying more than she had to. I have the bird still. It sits on the page in my tally book where I wrote the promise, holding down the corner. And under the promise, that last night on the trail, I started to write the ending, what it cost, what it bought, what I learned about the size of a man against the size of the world, and I got 3 words in and stopped. Because some counts you don't get to close. Some ledgers stay open on purpose, so the world knows you're still waiting on a payment that isn't coming. There's a boy at a school back east, or there was, with a scar on his wrist shaped like a held flame, and a mother on agency land who taught herself not to look back, and me out here with a bird carved from bone and a line I've never been able to finish.